Next morning, Stubb accosted Flask. Such a queer dream, King Post. I never had. You know the old man's ivory leg? Well, I dreamed he kicked me with it, and when I tried to kick back upon my soul, little man, I kicked my leg right off. And then, presto, Ahab seemed a pyramid, and I, like a blazing fool, kept kicking at it. What was still more curious, Flask? You know how curious all dreams are? Well, through all this rage that I was in, I somehow seemed to be thinking to myself that, after all, it's not much of an insult, that kick from Ahab. Why, thinks I watched the row. It's not a real leg, only a false leg. Oh, and there's a mighty difference between a living thump and a dead thump. That's what makes a blow from a hand Flask 50 times more savage to bear than a blow from a cane. The living member that makes the living insult, my little man. And thinks I to myself all the while, mind, while I was stubbing my silly toe against that cursed pyramid. So confoundedly contradictory was it all the while. I say, I'm thinking to myself, what's his leg now but a cane, a whalebone cane? Yes, thinks I, it's only a playful crudgeling. In fact, only a whaleboning that he gave me, not a base kick. Besides, thinks I, look at it once, well, the end of it, the foot part, what a small sort of end it is. Whereas if a broad-footed farmer kicked me, there's a devilish broad insult. But this insult is whittled down to a point only. But now comes the greatest stroke of the dream, Flask. While I was batting away at the pyramid, a sort of badger-haired old merman with a hump on his back takes me by the shoulders and slows me around. "What are you about?" says he. Slighted man, but I was frightened. Such a fizz. But somehow, next moment, I was over the fright. "What am I about?" says I at last. "And what business is that of yours? I should like to know, Mr. Humpback. Do you want a kick?" By the Lord, Flask, I had no sooner said that he turns around his stern to me, bent over and dragging up a lot of seaweed he had for a clout. What do you think I saw? Well, thunder alive, man, his stern was stuck full of marlin spikes with the point out. Says I on second thought, okay, I guess I won't kick you, old fella. "Why, Stubb," he says, "why, Stubb?" He kept muttering all the time and sort of eating of his own gums like a chimney hag. Seeing he wasn't going to stop saying over this, "Why, Stubb, why, Stubb?" I thought I might as well fall to kick in the pyramid again, but I only just lifted my foot for it when he roared out, "Stop that kicking!" "Hello," says I, "what's the matter now, old fellow?" "Look ye here," he says, "let's all give the insult Captain Ahab kicked ye, didn't he?" "Well, yes, he did," says I. "Right here it was." "Oh, very good," says he. "He used his ivory leg, didn't he?" "Well, yes, he did," says I. "Well then," says he, "why, Stubb, what have you complained of? Didn't he kick you with the right good will? It wasn't a common pitch pond leg he kicked with, was it?" "No, you were kicked by a great man, and with a beautiful ivory leg, Stubb. It's an honour, I consider it an honour. Listen, wild Stubb, in old England the greatest lords think it a great glory to be slapped by a queen and made God knights of it. But be your boast, Stubb, that you were kicked by old Ahab and made a wise man of it. Remember what I say, be kicked by him, account his kicks honour, and on no account kick back, for you can't help yourself, wise Stubb. Don't you see that pyramid?" With that, he all of a sudden seemed somehow in some queer fashion to swim off into the air. I snored, rolled over, and there I was in my hammock. I don't know what you think of that dream, little Flask. I don't know. Seems sort of foolish to me, though. Maybe. Oh, but it's made a wise man of me, Flask. Yeah, you see Ahab standing there sideways looking over the stone. What's the best thing you can do, Flask, is to let the old man alone. Never speak to him, whatever he says. Hello, what's that he says? Hark! "Master there, look sharply, there are whales hereabout. If you see a white one, split your lungs for him." What do you think of that now, Flask? Ain't there a small drop of something queer about that, eh? A white whale. Did you mark that, man? Look ye, there's something special in the wind. Stand by it for it, Flask. Ahab has that splotty on his mind. But, Mum, he comes this way. Already we are boldly launched upon the deep, but soon we shall be lost in its unshored, harborless immensities. Ere that come to pass, ere the Pequod's weedy hull rolls side by side with the barnacle halls of the Leviathan, at the outset it is but well to attend to a matter almost indispensable to a thorough appreciative understanding of the more special Leviathic revelations and allusions of all sorts which are to follow. It is some systemized exhibition of the whale in his broad genre that I would now fain put before you. Yet it is no easy task. The classification of the constituents of a chaos, nothing less, is here essayed. Listen to what the best and latest authors have laid down. No branch of zoology is so much involved as to that which is entitled cetology, says Captain Scorbsy, AD 1820. It is not my intention, were it in my power, to enter into the inquiry as to the true method of dividing the cetacea into groups and families. Utter confusion exists among the historians of this animal, the sperm whale, says Surgeon Bayal, AD 1839. Unfitness to pursue our research in the unfathomable waters, impenetrable veil covering our knowledge of the cetacea, a field strewn with thorns, all these incomplete indications but serve to torture us naturalists. Thus speak of the whale the great Sevier and John Hunter and Lesson, those lights of zoology and anatomy. Nevertheless, though, of real knowledge there is little, yet of books there are plenty, and so in some small degree with cetology or the science of whales. Many are the men, small and great, old and new, landsmen and seamen, who have at large or in little written of the whale. But to what ultimate generalizing purpose all of these have written? Of the names in this list of whale authors, only those following Owen ever saw living whales, and but one of them was a real professional harpooner and whaleman. I mean Captain Scorbsby. In the separate subject of the Greenland or white whale, he is the best existing author, but Scorbsby knew nothing and says nothing of the great sperm whale, compared with which the Greenland whale is almost unworthy mentioning. And here be it said that the Greenland whale is an usurper upon the throne of the sea. He is not even by any means the largest of the whales, yet owing to the long priority of his claims and the profound ignorance which still some 70 years back invested the fabulous or utterly unknown sperm whale, and which ignorance to this present day still reigns in all, but some few scientific retreats and whale ports, this usurpation has been every way complete. Reference to nearly all the Leviathanithic allusions in the great poets of the past day will satisfy you that the Greenland whale, without one rival, was to them the monarch of the seas. But the time has at last come for a new proclamation. This is Charing Cross. Hear ye, good people all, the Greenland whale is disposed, the great sperm whale now reigneth. There are only 2 books in being which at all pretend to put the living sperm whale before you, and at the same time, in the most remotest degree, succeed in the attempt. These books are Bayal's and Bennett's, both in their time surgeons to English South Sea whale ships, and both exact and reliable men. The original matter touching the sperm whale to be found in their volume is necessarily small, but so far as it goes, it is of excellent quality, though mostly confined to scientific description. As yet, however, the sperm whale, scientific or poetic, lives not complete in any literature. Far above all other hunted whales, he is an unwritten life. Now, the various species of whales need some sort of popular comprehensive classification, if only an easy outline, or one for the present, hereafter to be filled in all its departments by subsequent laborers. As no better man advances to take this matter in hand, I hereupon offer my own poor endeavor. I promise nothing complete, because any human thing supposed to be complete must for that very reason infallibly be faulty. I shall not pretend to a minute anatomical description of the various species, or, in this place at least, too much of any description. My object here is simply to project the drought of a systematization of cetology. I am the architect, not the builder. But it is a ponderous task. No ordinary letter sorter in the post office is equal to it. To grope down into the bottom of the sea after them, to have one's hands among the unspeakable foundations, ribs and very pelvis of the world, this is a fearful thing. What am I that I should essay to hook the nose of this Leviathan? The awful tauntings in Job might well appall me. Will he, the Leviathan, make a covenant with thee? Behold, the hope of him is vain. But I have swam through libraries and sailed through oceans. I have had to do with whales with these visible hands. I am in earnest, and I will try. There are some preliminaries to settle. First, the uncertain, unsettled condition of this science of cetology is in the very vestibule attested by the fact that, in some quarters, it still remains a moot point whether a whale be a fish. In his System of Nature, AD 1776, Linnaeus declares, "I hereby separate the whales from the fish." But of my own knowledge, I know that down to the year of 1850, sharks and shade, alewives and herring, against Linnaeus's express edict, were still found dividing the possessions of the same seas with the Leviathan. The grounds upon which Linnaeus would fain have banished the whales from the waters he states as follows: on account of their warm bilocular heart, their lungs, their movable eyelids, their hollow ears, penum, intrinum, fenimum, mammis, lanctinum, and finally, ex leg nature jure methequa. I submitted all this to my friends, Simon Macy and Charlie Coffin of Nantucket, both messmates of mine on a certain voyage, and they united in the opinion that the reasons set forth were altogether insufficient. Charlie profanely hinted they were humbug. Be it known that, waiving all argument, I take the good old-fashioned ground that the whale is a fish, and call upon Holy Jonah to back me. This fundamental thing settled, the next point is, in what internal respect does the whale differ from other fish? Above, Linnaeus has given you these items, but in brief, they are these: lungs and warm blood, whereas all other fish are lungless and cold-blooded. Next, how shall we define the whale by his obvious externals so as conspicuously to label him for all time to come? To be short, then, a whale is a spouting fish with a horizontal tail. There you have him. However contracted, that definition is the result of expanded meditation. A walrus spouts much like a whale, but the walrus is not a fish, because he is amphibious. But the last term of the definition is still more cogent as coupled with the fish. Almost anyone must have noticed that all the fish familiar to landsmen have not a flat, but a vertical or up and down tail. Whereas among spouting fish, the tail, though it may be similarly shaped, invariably assumes a horizontal position. By the above definition of what a whale is, I do by no means exclude from the Leviathic brotherhood of any sea creature hitherto identified with the whale by the best informed Nantucketers, nor on the other hand link with it any fish hitherto authoritatively regarded as alien. Hence all the smaller, spouting and horizontal-tailed fish must be included in the ground plan of cetology. Now then, come the grand divisions of the entire whale host. I'm aware that down to the present time the fish-styled Lamantis and Dungans, a pigfish and sowfish of the coffins of Nantucket, are included by many naturalists among the whales. But as these pigfish are a noisy, contemptible set, mostly lurking in the mouths of rivers and feeding on wet hay, and especially as they do not spout, I deny their credentials as whales, and have presented them with their passports to quit the kingdom of cetology. First, according to magnitude, I divide the whales into 3 preliminary books, as subdivisions into chapters, and these shall comprehend them all, both small and large. Number 1, the folio whale. 2, the octavo whale. 3, the duodecimo whale. As the type of the folio, I present the sperm whale. Of the octavo, the grampus. Of the duodecimo, the porpoise. Folios. Among these, I here include the following chapters. 1, the sperm whale. 2, the right whale. 3, the finback whale. 4, the humpback whale. 5, the razorback whale. And 6, the sulfur bottom whale. Octavos. These embrace the whales of middling magnitude, among which present may be numbered. 1, the grampus. 2, the blackfish. 3, the narwhal. 4, the thrasher. 5, the killer. Why this book of whales is not denominated the quarto is very plain, because while the whales of this order, though smaller than those of the former order, nevertheless retain a proportionate likeness to them in figure, yet the bookbinder's quarto volume in its dimensioned form does not preserve the shape of the folio volume, but the octavo volume does. The duodecimos. These include the smaller whales. 1, the Haza porpoise. 2, the Algerian porpoise. 3, the mealy-mouthed porpoise. To those who have not chanced specially to study the subject, it may possibly seem strange that fishes not commonly exceeding 4 or 5 feet should be marshaled among whales, a word which, in the popular sense, always conveys an idea of hugeness. But the creatures set down upon a duodecimo are infallibly whales, by the terms of my definition of what a whale is, i.e., a spouting fish with a horizontal tail. Beyond the duodecimal, the system does not proceed, inasmuch as the porpoise is the smallest of the whales. Above, you have all the leviathans of note. But there are a rubble of uncertain, fugitive, half-fabulous whales, which, as an American whaleman, I know by reputation, but not personally. I shall enumerate them by their forecastle appellations, for possibly such a list may be valuable to future investigators who may complete what I have here but begun. If any of the following whales shall hereafter be caught and marked, then he can readily be incorporated into the system according to his folio, octavo, or duodecimo magnitude. The bottlenose whale, the junk whale, the pudding-head whale, the cape whale, the leading whale, the cannon whale, the scraggy whale, the copperhead whale, the elephant whale, the iceberg whale, the quahog whale, the blue whale, etc. From Icelandic, Dutch, and Old English authorities, there might be quoted other lists of uncertain whales, blessed with all manner of uncouth names. But I omit them as altogether obsolete, and can hardly help suspecting them for mere sounds, full of leviathanism, but signifying nothing. Finally, as it was stated at the outset that this system would not be here and at once perfected, you cannot but plainly see that I have kept my word. But I now leave my cetological system standing thus unfinished, even as the great cathedral of Cologne was left with the crane still standing upon the top of the uncompleted tower. For small erections may be finished by their first architects. Grand ones, true ones, ever leave the copstone to posterity. God keep me from ever completing anything. This whole book is but a drought, nay, but the drought of a drought. O time, strength, cash, and patience. Concerning the officers of the whalecraft, this seems as good a place as any to set down a little domestic peculiarity on shipboard, arising from the existence of the harpooner class of officers, a class unknown, of course, in any other marines than the whale fleet. The large importance attached to the harpooner's vocation is evinced by the fact that originally, in the old Dutch fishery 2 centuries or more ago, the command of a whale ship was not wholly lodged in the person now called the captain, but was divided between him and an officer called the specksnider. Literally, this word means fat cutter. Usage, however, in time made it equivalent to a chief harpooner. In those days, the captain's authority was restricted to the navigation and general management of the vessel, while over the whale hunting department and all its concerns, the specksnider, or chief harpooner, reigned supreme. In the British Greenland fishery, under the corrupted title of specksioneer, this old Dutch official is still retained, but his former dignity is sadly abridged. At present, he ranks simply as a senior harpooner, and as such is but one of the captain's more inferior subordinates. Nevertheless, as upon the good conduct of the harpooners the success of a whaling voyage largely depends, and since in the American fishery he is not only an important officer in the boat, but under certain circumstances, night watchers on the whaling ground, the command of the ship's decks is also his. Therefore the grand political maxim of the sea demands that he should nominally live apart from the men before the mast, and be in some way distinguished as their professional superior, though always by them familiarly regarded as their social equal. Now, the grand distinction drawn between officer and man at sea is this: the first lives aft, the last forward. Hence, in whale ships and merchantmen alike, the mates have their quarters with the captain, and so too, in most of the American whalers, the harpooners are lodged in the aft part of the ship. That is to say, they take their meals in the captain's cabin and sleep in a place indirectly communicating with it. Though the long period of a southern whaling voyage, by far the longest of all voyages now or ever made by man, the peculiar perils of it and the community of interest prevailing among a company, all of whom, high or low, depend for their profits not upon fixed wages, but upon their common luck, together with their common vigilance, intrepidity, and hard work, though all these things do in some case tend to beget a less rigorous discipline than in merchantmen generally, yet never mind how much like an old Mesopotamian family those whalemen may, in some primitive instances, live together. For all that, the punctilious externals at least of the quarter-deck are seldom materially relaxed, and in no instance done away. Indeed, many are the Nantucket ships in which you will see the skipper parading his quarterdeck with an elated grandeur not surpassed in any military navy, nay, extorting almost as much outward homage as if he wore the imperial purple and not the shabbiest of pilot cloth. And though of all men the moody captain of the Pequod was the least given to that sort of shallowest assumption, and though the only homage he ever exacted was implicit, instantaneous obedience, though he required no man to remove the shoes of his feet ere stepping upon the quarterdeck, and though there were times when, owing to peculiar circumstances connected with events hereafter to be detailed, he addressed them in unusual terms, whether of condescension or interium, or otherwise, yet even Captain Ahab was by no means unobservant of the paramount forms and usages of the sea. Nor perhaps will it fail to be eventually perceived that behind those forms and usages, as it were, he sometimes masked himself, incidentally making use of them for other and more private ends than they were legitimately intended to be subserve. That certain sultanism of his brain, which had otherwise in a good degree remained unmanifested, through these forms that same sultanism became incarnate in an irresistible dictatorship. For be a man's intellectual superiority what it will, it can never assume the practical, available supremacy every other man without the aid of some sort of external arts and entrenchments, always in themselves more or less paltry and base. That it is that forever keeps God's true princes of the empire from the world's hustings, and leaves the highest honors that this air can give to those men who become famous more through their infinite inferiority to the choice, hidden handful of the divine inert, than through their undoubted superiority over the dead level of the mass. Such large virtue lurks in those small things when extreme political superstitions invest them, that in some royal instances, even to idiot imbecility that they have imparted potency. But when in the case of Nicholas the Tsar, the ringed crown of geographical empire encircles an imperial brain, then the plebeian herds crouch abased before the tremendous civil centralization. Nor will the tragic dramatist who will depict mortal indenominables in the fullest sweep and direct swing ever forget a hint, incidentally so important in his art, as the one now alluded to. But Ahab, my captain, still moves before me in all his Nantucket grimness and shagginess, and in this episode touching emperors and kings, I must not conceal that I have only to do with a poor old whale hunter-like man, and therefore all outward majestical trappings and housings are denied me. O Ahab, what shall be grand in thee, it must needs be plucked at from the skies, and dived for in the deep, and featured in the unbodied air. It is noon, and Doughboy, the steward, thrusting his pale loaf of bread face from the cabin scuttle, announces dinner to his lord and master, who, sitting in the lee quarter-boat, has just been taking an observation of the sun, and is now mutely reckoning the latitude on the smooth, medallion-shaped tablet reserved for that daily purpose on the upper part of his ivory leg. From his complete inattention to the tidings, you would think that moody Ahab had not heard his menial, but presently, catching hold of the mizzen shrouds, he swings himself to the deck, and in an even, unexhilarated voice, saying, "Dinner, Mr. Starbuck," disappears into the cabin. When the last echo of his sultan's step has died away, and Starbuck, the first emir, has every reason to suppose that he is seated, then Starbuck roses from his quietude, takes a few turns along the planks, and after a grave peep into the binacle, says with some touch of pleasantries, "Dinner, Mr. Stubb," and descends the scuttle. The second emir lounges about the rigging a while, and then, slightly shaking the main brace to see whether it will be all right with that important rope, he likewise takes up the old burden, and with a rapid "Dinner, Mr. Flosk," follows after his predecessors. But the third emir, now seeing himself all alone on the quarterdeck, seems to feel relieved from some curious restraint, for tipping all sorts of knowing winks in all sorts of directions, and kicking off his shoes, he strikes into a sharp but noiseless squall of a hornpipe right over the Grand Turk's head, and then, by a dexterous sleight, pitching his cap up into the mizzen top of a shelf, he goes down roll-licking, so far at least as he remains visible from the deck, reversing all over processions by bringing up the rear with music. But ere stepping into the cabin doorway below, he pauses, ships a new face altogether, and then independent, hilarious little Flask enters King Ahab's presence in the character of Abjutus, or the slave. It is not the least among the strange things bred by the intense artificialness of sea usage that while in the open air of the deck, some officers will, upon provocation, bear themselves boldly and defyingly enough towards their commander. Yet 10 to 1, let those very officers the next moment go down to their customary dinner in that same commander's cabin, and straightway their inoffensive, not to say depractory and humble air towards him as he sits at the head of the table. This is marvelous, sometimes almost comical. Wherefore the difference? A problem? Perhaps not. To have been Belshazzar, king of Babylon, and to have been Belshazzar, not haughtily but courteously, therein certainly must have been some touch of mundane grandeur. But he who is in the rightly regal and intelligent spirit presides over his own private dinner table of invited guests. The man's unchallenged power in the domain of individual influence for the time. That man's royalty of state transcends Belshazzar's, for Belshazzar was not the greatest. Who has but once dined his friends has tasted what it is to be Caesar. It is a witchery of social czarship, which there is notwithstanding. Now, if this consideration you superadd the official supremacy of the shipmaster, then by inference you will derive the cause of that peculiarity of sea life just mentioned. Over his ivory inlaid table, Ahab presided like a mute, manned sea lion on the white coral beach, surrounded by his warlike but still differential cubs. In his own proper turn, each officer awaited to be served. They were as little children before Ahab, and yet in Ahab there seemed not to lurk the smallest social arrogance. With one mind, their intent eyes all fastened upon the old man's knife as he carved the sheep dish before him. I do not suppose that for the world they would have profaned that moment with the slightest observations, even upon so neutral a topic as the weather. No. And when reaching out his knife and fork, between which the slice of beef was locked, Ahab thereby motioned Starbuck's plate towards him, the mate received his meat as though receiving alms, and cut it tenderly, and a little started, if perchance the knife grazed against the plate, and chewed noiselessly and swallowed it, not without circumspection. For like the coronation banquet at Frankfurt, where the German emperor profoundly dines with the 7 imperial electors, so these cabin meals are somehow solemn meals eaten in awful silence. And yet at the table old Ahab forbade not conversation, only he himself was dumb. What a relief it was to choking Stubb when a rat made a sudden racket in the hold below. And poor little Flask, though he was the youngest son, and little boy of this weary family party. He was the shin bones of the Salem beef. He would have been the drumsticks. For Flask to have presumed to help himself, this must have seemed to him tantamount to larceny in the first degree. Had he helped himself at the table, doubtless nevermore would he have been able to hold his head up in the honest world. Nevertheless, strange to say, Ahab never forbade him. And if Flask helped himself, the chances were Ahab had never so much as noticed it. Least of all did Flask presume to help himself to butter, whether he thought the owners of the ship denied it to him on account of its clouding his clear, sunny complexion, or whether he deemed that on some long voyage in such markless waters, butter was at a premium, and therefore was not for him, a subaltern. However it was, Flask, alas, was a butterless man. Another thing, Flask was the last person down at the dinner, and Flask is the first man up. Consider. For hereby Flask's dinner was badly jammed in point of time. Starbuck and Stubb both had the start on him, and yet they also have the privilege of lounging in the rear. If Stubb, even, who is but a peg higher than Flask, happens to have but a small appetite, and soon shows symptoms of concluding his repast, then Flask must bestir himself. He will not get more than 3 mouthfuls that day, for it is against holy usage for Stubb to precede Flask to the deck. Therefore it was that Flask once admitted in private that ever since he had arisen to the dignity of an officer, from that moment he has never known what it was to be otherwise than hungry, more or less. For what he ate did not so much relieve his hunger as it kept it immortal in him. Peace and satisfaction, thought Flask, have forever departed from my stomach. I am an officer, but how I wish I could fish a bit of old-fashioned beef in the forecastle as I used to when I was before the mast. There's the fruits of promotion now. There's the vanity of glory. There's the insanity of life. Besides, if it were so that any mere sailor of the Pequod had a grudge against Flask in Flask's official capacity, all that sailor had to do in order to obtain ample vengeance was to go aft at dinner time and get a peep at Flask through the cabin skylight, sitting silly and dumbfoundedly before awful Ahab. Now, Ahab and his three mates formed what may be called the first table in the Pequod's cabin. After their departure, taking place in adverted order in their arrival, the canvas cloth was covered, or rather was restored to some hurried order by the pallid steward, and then the three harpooners were bidden to the feast. They made a sort of temporary servants' hall of the high and mighty cabin. In strange contrast to the hardly tolerable constraint and nameless and visible domineering of the captain's table was the entire carefree license and ease, the almost frantic democracy of those inferior fellows, the harpooners. While their masters, the mates, seemed afraid of the sound of the hinges of their own jaws, the harpooners chewed their food with such a relish that there was a report to it. They dined like lords. They filled their bellies like Indian ships, all day loading with spices. Such portentous appetites had Queequeg and Tashtego that to fill out the vacancies made by the previous repast, oft the pale doughboy was fain to bring on a great baron of salt junk, seemingly quarried out of the solid ox. And if he were not lively about it, if he did not go with a nimble hop, skip, and a jump, then Tashtego had an ungentlemanly way of accelerating him by darting a fort at his back harpoon-wise. And once, Dago, seized with a sudden humor, assisted Doughboy's memory by snatching him up bodily and thrusting his head into a great empty wooden trencher while Tashtego, knife in hand, began laying out the circle preliminary to scalping him. He was naturally a very nervous, shuddering sort of little fellow, this bread-faced steward, the progeny of a bankrupt banker and a hospital nurse. And what with the standing spectacle of the black, terrific Ahab and the periodical tumultuous visitations of these three savages, Doughboy's whole life was one continual lip quiver. Commonly, after seeing the harpooners furnished with all things they demanded, he would escape from their clutches into his little pantry adjoining and fearfully peep out at them through the blinds of its door till all was over. It was a sight to see Queequeg seated over against Tashtego, opposing his filed teeth to the Indians. Crosswise to them, Dago seated on the floor, for a bench would have brought his hearse-plumped head to the low carlins. At every motion of his colossal limbs making the low cabin framework to shake, as when an African elephant goes passenger in a ship. But for all this, the great Negro was wonderfully abstemious, not to say dainty. It seemed hardly possible that by such comparatively small mouthfuls he would keep up the vitality diffused through so broad of air, and through his dilated nostrils snuffed in the sublime life of the worlds. Not by beef or by bread are giants made or nourished. But Queequeg had a mortal barbaric smack of the lip in eating, an ugly sound enough, so much so that the trembling doughboy almost looked to see where any marks of teeth lurked in his own lean arms. And then he would hear Tashtego singing out for him to produce himself, that his bones might be picked. The simple-witted steward all but shattered the crockery hanging round him in the pantry by his sudden fits of the palsy. Nor did the whetstone, which the harpooners carried in their pockets for their lances and other weapons, and with which whetstone at dinner they would ostentatiously sharpen their knives, that grating sound did not at all tend to tranquilize poor Doughboy. How could he forget that in his island days, Queequeg, for one, must certainly have been guilty of some murderous convivial indiscretions? Alas, Doughboy, hard fares the white waiter who waits upon cannibals. Not a napkin should he carry on his arms, but a buckler. In good time, though, to his great delight, the three salt-sea warriors would rise and depart, to their credulous, fable-monger ears all the martial bones jingling in them at every step, like Moorish scimitars and scabbards. But though these barbarians dined in the cabin and nominally lived there, still, being anything but sedentary in their habits, they were scarcely ever in it except at mealtimes, and just before sleeping time when they passed through it in their own peculiar quarters. In this one matter, Ahab seemed no exception to most American whale captains, who, as a set, rather inclined to the opinion that by rights the ship's cabin belongs to them, and that it is by courtesy alone that anybody else is, at any time, permitted there. So that in real truth the mates and harpooners of the Pequod might more properly be said to have lived out of the cabin rather than in it. For when they did enter it, it was something as a street door enters a house, turning inwards for a moment only to be turned out next, and as a permanent thing residing in the open air. Nor did they lose much hereby. In the cabin was no companionship. Socially, Ahab was inaccessible. Though nominally included in the census of Christendom, he was still an alien to it. He lived in the world as the last of the grizzly bears lived in settled Missouri. And as when spring and summer had departed, that wild Logan of the woods, burying himself in the hollow of a tree, lived out the winter there, sucking his own paws, so in his inclement, howling old age, Ahab's soul shut up in the caved trunk of his body, there fed upon the sullen paw of its gloom.